The diminutive director of San Diego's historic Whaley House Museum decided that the rainstorm would curtail the usual crush of visitors to the restored 1956 brick home. June Redding had shown only a handful of tourists through the exquisitely decorated 19th century rooms that morning, proudly pointing out the 1853 Jenny Lind piano and a unique collection of antique music boxes, Andrew Jackson's favorite sofa, and the dozens of other pieces of period furniture. So June left for an early lunch. A young woman who had worked there as a guide at the house for only a short period of time was left in charge. When I got back, she met me at the door, June recalled, on that day several years ago. She said that while I was gone, she had heard the heavy tread of bootsteps not once but twice at intervals on the second floor. June remembered that a young boy had toured the house just before lunch. He expressed a keen interest in the ghostly legends connected with the place. He had even sat for a time on the stairs to see if he could hear anything. June hadn't paid much attention to him, but now she wondered if he could have somehow sneaked back into the house. June and the young guy decided to look around. As they reached the top of the main staircase, they were surprised to see a large hallway window standing open. Great rolling thunderheads rumbled off the Pacific Ocean. Rain was blowing into the window, soaking the curtains and carpeting. June was sure the window had been closed earlier in the day. Had the young boy opened it and then climbed back in after he left through the front door? June wondered. While June found towels to mop up the water, her companion quickly checked through the bedrooms. She didn't think anyone had been up there, June said. I then tried to close the window, but the white cedar frame was swollen. I could hardly get it closed. It was so hard to pull the bolt pin back that I said we'd have to get a hammer to pound it back in. Finally, between the two of us, we managed to get that bolt back and shut the window. One thing was certain, however. The frame was so enlarged that a child the age of the young visitor couldn't possibly have opened the window in the first place. If not the young boy, who? June thinks the answer to the question is connected to the rest of her adventure that afternoon. We walked into the nursery and looked around, June said. She was still trying to find an explanation for the footsteps. One of the museum's proudest possessions is a collection of antique dolls in the nursery, arranged as if waiting for the return of a favorite little girl. June's companion said that she had been asked about the dolls while giving tours and wanted to know more about them. I started talking about them and ended up holding a doll so small that it's difficult to show unless you actually stand and look at it closely, June said. I think they used to sell them for a penny a piece. It was a tiny hand-crocheted dress on and a little bonnet. The guide remarked that she had never seen anything so tiny as the doll June cradled in her palm. And the next moment, from the dark hallway came the baritone laugh of a man. Very pleasant. It was not malicious or evil, but clearly of human origin. Neither of us said anything at first. We didn't move. And then she said, "Did you hear that?" I just kept looking at the doll and asked what she heard. "A man's laughter," she replied. "I did too," June recalls with a shudder. Both women fled down the stairs. "It was the most profound thing that ever happened to me," June emphasized. "Something happened upstairs in that nursery. Something touched me. It was like an electric shock. That laughter hit me and went down my spine, my legs, my arms. I just felt like I had had contact with the unseen world." For June Redding, that rain-swept afternoon was finally proof that her beloved Whaley house is haunted. But to understand what spectral beings laugh and cry and even occasionally are seen and smelled in the lovingly restored home, it is necessary to go back to the very origins of that dazzling Southern California city on the bay. San Diego was little more than a frontier outpost in 1849, the year Thomas Whaley first visited there. A well-educated member of an old Eastern family that traced its lineage to early 17th century Britain, Whaley couldn't have found a sharper contrast with his upbringing than life in the predominantly Spanish village El Pueblo de San Diego. The legendary Padre Junipero Sierra founded his California mission, San Diego de Acala, nearby in 1769. It wasn't until the 1820s, however, that a small community grew at the base of Presidio Hill, the site of Padre Sierra's church, and now the historic district known as Old Town. What Thomas Whaley found was a rough-hewn collection of Mexican adobe and American wood frame buildings clustered around a plaza. Only 3 years prior to Whaley's visit in 1846, the American flag had been raised in the plaza of the Old Pueblo, effectively ending Mexico's dominance over the territory. Thomas Whaley didn't stay long the first time he landed in San Diego. Sent by his company to start mercantile businesses in California, Whaley continued on to San Francisco, but he returned to San Diego in 1851 and started in business with a general store on the plaza. His partner was Philip Costhwaite, who was later to become county clerk and sheriff. By 1857, the year Thomas Whaley started building his red brick home, the Eastern businessman was prospering. He returned to New York to marry Anna Eloise de Launay and brought her back to California. Whaley also started drawing up plans for a two-story. Whaley also started drawing up the plans for a Greek revival mansion, the likes of which had never been seen in old California. But another more sinister event would take place, one that would forever shape the haunting legend that has come to envelop Thomas Whaley's home. That had to do with Yankee Jim Robinson, a tall, mysterious drifter with unruly blonde hair. No one really knows who Yankee Jim really was, or where he came from. Historians think he may have been one Santiago Robinson, a Bermudan who came to California in 1842. Santiago is the Spanish name for James, or Robinson may have been Nova Scotian, or even a so-called Sydney Duck, one of the former Australian convicts who settled in early southern California. He may have been the founder of a long-vanished settlement in Placer County, California, called Yankee Jim's Diggings. According to state records, a man named James Robinson discovered gold in the vicinity in 1850. Whatever his origins, it is known that one James W. Robinson, alias Yankee Jim, was spotted rowing surreptitiously towards the schooner Plutus, a 30-ton vessel sometimes called a pilot boat, anchored in San Diego's harbor on August 13, 1852. Its owner, James Keating, captain of the ship, was standing on shore and hailed the intruder. He thought someone might be trying to steal his ship, a hanging offense in early California. When Robinson did not reply, Keating fired several rounds of buckshot that missed the rowboat and Robinson. Robinson made for shore and headed inland through the scrub oak. Keating waited until the next morning to make a report to the authorities in San Diego. Sheriff Rayner mounted a posse and soon brought in two men thought to be Robinson's accomplices, William Harris, alias William Harney, and James Grayson Loring. Both were charged with grand larceny. They supposedly admitted to being professional horse thieves. Robinson, however, was not so easy prey. Sheriff Rayner warned residents near False Bay, where Robinson had put ashore, to be on the lookout for a tall man wearing a red shirt. Shortly after dark on Saturday, August 14, 1852, a man answering Robinson's description showed up at the door of a Mexican couple in a settlement known as Rose's Ranch. He asked for something to eat but grew nervous when the couple acted suspiciously. Robinson fled the house with the Mexican couple at his heels. The husband managed to throw a lasso around the suspect and then thwacked him on the head with a Spanish artillery sword. The couple lashed the unconscious and bleeding Robinson across the back of a horse and took him to the sheriff. 3 days later, Yankee Jim Robinson was tried and found guilty of grand larceny. On August 18th, he was sentenced to be hanged exactly 1 month later. His accomplices were, for some reason, let off with lesser prison sentences. The irony is that only Yankee Jim was sentenced to die for what seems now to be a minor crime. Later research established that it was the intent of Robinson and his Confederates to steal the pilot boat Plutus that resulted in the stiff sentence for Robinson, the mastermind of the attempted theft. Robinson didn't make his 30-day waiting period. There was no jail in San Diego. A number of citizens gathered on the afternoon of the verdict to hold a public meeting on the question of whether Yankee Jim should swing on that very same day. Cooler heads prevailed, however, and various local men took turns guarding the prison until the court imposed hanging. At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of September 18, 1852, Yankee Jim Robinson stood in the back of a buckboard, one end of a hemp noose knotted around his neck and the other attached to the gallows. Asked if he had any final words, Robinson launched upon a soliloquy that silenced the anxious spectators. 30 minutes later, the desperado still hadn't slowed his patter. The crowd was nervous. By law, all executions had to be carried out by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it looked like Robinson might talk until midnight. Sheriff Rayner wasn't about to let that happen. With a brief nod of his head, Rayner signaled for the horses to pull the wagon away, silencing Yankee Jim in mid-sentence. But a ghastly error had been made. The scaffold had been built for shorter men. The toes of Robinson's boots scraped the ground. Yankee Jim Robinson slowly strangled to death. Upon the spectators at the hanging was Thomas Whaley. 4 years later, he would build his home on the precise spot where Robinson died an agonizing death. Yankee Jim Robinson was never rested easily in his grave. On September 15, 1855, Thomas Whaley paid the grand sum of $302 for a 150 by 217-foot parcel of land, 8½ acres, which included a freshwater spring and the old execution grounds. Construction on his house began in May 1856 and was completed 1 year later. The home Whaley designed was the Greek Revival style, a popular motif in the 19th century, but quite unlike anything else in early San Diego. Early Anglo settlers wanted everything they did or built to be American, or more precisely, Eastern American. Amidst the Mexican adobe and wood frame boxes that rose a Yankee mansion, the first truly American home in Southern California. Because of the expense and shipping materials to California from the east and the lack of building supplies on the frontier, Whaley had to supply his own. He established a brickyard 300 yards from his future home to make bricks for the exterior siding. Tar for the roof came from the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. Plaster for the walls were mixed with horsehair, river sand, and crushed seashells gathered by Indians. The main house continued to build and had 7 rooms, a kitchen, a parlor, a music room, and a library downstairs, with 4 bedrooms on the second floor, reached by a wide staircase and a spacious hallway. Whaley also built a dirt floor granary next to his house that was eventually connected to the house. Behind her fine home, Anna Whaley planted a garden. She was particularly proud of her several varieties of roses. The house cost $10,000 to build, a substantial sum in the 1850s California. Within a few years, the Whaley house became the social center of the community. Whenever citizens wanted to meet and discuss one issue or the other, Thomas Whaley generously offered the use of his airy rooms. Visiting dignitaries often stayed there, enjoying Anna's gracious hospitality and lavish parties. Presidents Ulysses S. Grant and Benjamin Harrison are known to have spent nights in the house. Union General Thomas Sedgwick was headquartered there during the Civil War. For a few years, a traveling theatrical company, the Tanner Troupe, used the granary as a playhouse. Except for a period of about 6 years when Thomas Whaley traveled to Alaska and established the city of Sitka, members of the Whaley family lived in the home until 1953. The most notable event connected with the Whaley house occurred during its use as the San Diego County Courthouse in the late 1860s. Thomas Whaley had offered the use of his old granary, bearing all the costs of remodeling it into a courtroom. He charged the county a numeral $65 per year for rent. Trouble was brewing, however. Tensions between the people of the old town and a development in so-called New Town led to open conflicts. There was a sentiment among some elected officials that the county should have a bigger courthouse in the newer section of town. Thomas Whaley obviously disagreed. He turned out to be on the wrong side of the argument. Despite the posting of guards and a declaration of martial law, on the night of March 31st, 1871, a group of armed men led by County Clerk and Recorder Colonel Chalmers Scott broke into Whaley's house and stole all the court county records. Whaley was away on a business trip to San Francisco. His wife was forced back into her room at gunpoint when she got up to investigate noises in the county offices. Scott and his henchmen transported the records to the Wells Fargo building on 6th and G Streets. That building was used as a courthouse until a new one was built in 1872. Whaley was left with an empty courtroom and 6 months' rent due he never collected. Thomas Whaley died in 1890, still bitter over what he considered the shoddy treatment afforded him by the city and county, particularly their refusal to pay for damages he claimed was caused by Colonel Scott and his night raiders. The colorful legacies provided by Yankee Jim Robinson, Thomas Whaley, and others, together with at least one alleged murder, provided the Whaley house with a history of hauntings that began at least 50 years ago. The first to suggest the presence of ghosts was Corinne Lillian Whaley, Thomas and Anna's youngest daughter, who lived in the house until she died in 1953 at the age of 89. According to some accounts, her seldom ventured to the second floor. She wrote in her memoirs that a force of some sort didn't want her in the upstairs bedroom. She said so many strange occurrences had taken place that she slept only fitfully and was always uncomfortable in her ancestral home. Lillian remained a gracious hostess, however, right up until her death, often inviting old friends over for visit. Christmas was her favorite time of the year. She would have the descendants of other pioneer families stop in for refreshments on Christmas Day. Even when she became too frail to put up a Christmas tree, she took out her charming assortments of antique ornaments and placed them in the lighted windows and on the fireplace mantel. What disturbed Lillian about the house also puzzled her visitors. Friends reported that as they sat chatting in the parlor, the distinct sounds of a man pacing in heavy boots were heard upstairs. Lillian tried to ignore the noises. Her friends often assumed another person was in the house, but as the afternoon or evening wore on, no one else appeared. Lillian Whaley said it was Yankee Jim who walked in her house. In 1956, the Whaley house was scheduled for demolition when a group of San Diego citizens formed a historic shrine foundation to buy the land and build San Diego County eventually. San Diego County eventually agreed to preserve the house as a museum and restore it to its original grandeur. The foundation maintains maintains it today as a reminder of the city's colorful early days. Jean Redding spearheaded the efforts to save the house and served for over 30 years as the museum's director. Even before the restoration was completed in 1960, she had her first experience with one of the 4 ghosts known to haunt Whaley House. "We were all moving the furniture over here from storage," Mrs. Redding recalled. 2 men from the historical societies were helping me move the big pieces of furniture in. I remember coming in, walking right straight through the house and opening the back door so the delivery men could bring in the furniture. They backed up the truck so close as they could. We all heard the sound of someone walking the floor upstairs, like a man's barefoot steps. The floors were bare at the time, so we heard his heels hitting the floorboards. It was a big man from what I could tell, and it seemed like he was wearing boots. Both of the men helping me said there was someone upstairs. I thought it was probably one of the workmen, although it was funny that he didn't call out and identify himself. I started up the stairs and got about halfway up when I saw that the shutters were closed and there was no signs of life. I did call out, but I didn't get any response. Well, I turned around and came back down. I told them there was nobody up there. They looked kind of smug. Then one of them said, 'Well, maybe old Thomas Whaley's come back to look at the house over.' We all kind of laughed, but from that time on," June's voice trails off as she shrugs her shoulders. Thomas Whaley, or Yankee Jim Robinson. Whaley was known to pace the floors upstairs hallway. He would also stand for hours on the balcony watching the distant harbor for incoming ships. Research has found that the old gallows stood where an archway leads from the entryway into the music room, and Jane Reading thinks the man she and the workmen heard that day was Yankee Jim. She notes that he was tall, heavy-set man, given to wear tall boots. Sometimes it's not just the pacing that upsets the staff. A tour guide was eating her noon lunch when she heard noises upstairs. She got up to investigate and saw a man wearing a frock coat standing at the top of the stairs. His face was turned away from her. Before she could call out, the figure faded away. Mrs. Redding has also seen a ghostly figure of what she believes is Thomas Whaley standing near the stairs on the 2nd floor. He appeared one Sunday afternoon when we were quite busy. A guide called out to come and look at something. I walked back to look up the stairs, and sure enough, there he was. There were people up there, but they were all looking in the doorways of the bedrooms. He had a black hat on with a wide brim and this long coat. He was solid, but only there for a moment. He was all by himself, right in the middle of the landing. I couldn't believe my eyes. Whaley doesn't confine himself to the indoors. Several people have seen him strolling through the gardens near a fern bed at the rear of the house. Sheila Furness has a delightful British accent, a decided belief in the supernatural, and abiding interest in the Whaley house, where she works as a volunteer guide. She is often overwhelmed by the smell of cigar smoke. Whaley smoked a distinctive brand of Havana cigars. The odor is so strong that Mrs. Furness has to retreat to the front porch for a breath of fresh air. Around Christmas time, other odors permeate the kitchen even though no one is cooking. Apple butter, fresh baked bread, and coffee. Oddly enough, sometimes only one person in a group will detect the cigar smoke or baking odors, Mrs. Furness said. A sickly sweet perfume is another smell that guides and volunteers have noticed. Jessie Keller, a longtime volunteer at the house, said it's so easy it almost makes her sick. I've smelled her, Anna Whaley's perfume, and have been the only one. The last time was right by the parlor door. Mrs. Redding was in the dining room. I asked her if she could smell that perfume. She came in here and only I could smell it. It was so strange. It can be so heavy, Mrs. Keller said, shaking her head. Anna Whaley has also put in a few appearances at the house Thomas built for her. Her most famous visit came in 1964 when the TV star Regis Philbin spotted her early one morning while he was conducting an investigation of the house. According to written accounts, Philbin and a friend were sitting on the Andrew Jackson sofa when an image identified as that of Anna Whaley materialized in the study, floating through the music room and into the parlor where Philbin was sitting. She evaporated when Philbin shined a flashlight in her direction. Yet reports of Anna's ghost go back to an even earlier times. June Redding recalls a visit by a man who said he delivered newspapers in the neighborhood when he was a boy. He said that he would stand opposite the house in the early morning hours waiting for the delivery truck to drop off his bundle of newspapers. He said he would glance across the street and see a lady dressed in blue standing behind an uncurtained window. There was no one living in the house at that time. In more recent times, a rocking chair in Anna's old bedroom sometimes rocks back and forth, a bit upsetting for the tourists trying to listen to a guide's lecture about the house. For several years, Mrs. Redding kept a log of unusual phenomena observed by staff members and visitors. Several entries relate to the ghost of Anna Whaley. On January 5, 1963, a guide reported hearing music and laughter for about 30 seconds. He said it sounded like a woman singing "Home Again." The same guide, Lawrence Riverall, saw the vague form of a woman in a hoop skirt in September 1964. He said the woman was very slight. She was standing in the hallway, but because of the dim light, he couldn't see her face. A visitor told June Redding that 2 days after Christmas 1964, he saw the ghost of a woman wearing a green plaid gingham dress. Her hair was long and dark, coiled into a bun. She was sitting on a settee in Anna's old bedroom. While Mrs. Redding and her staff held a meeting one afternoon to discuss an upcoming party at the house, one of her assistants took a photograph of the group sitting in the old courtroom. When the pictures were developed, there seemed to be a faintly outlined figure of a woman standing nearby. "She loved parties," June said. "Maybe our conversation drew Anna to listen in on the plans." Anna Whaley is not the only female ghost to haunt Whaley House. One of the strangest incidents involved what might have been the ghost of one of the Whaley daughters. In August 1976, an unusual high concentration of static electricity was plaguing the house, according to Mrs. Redding. One afternoon, a visitor was touring the upstairs bedroom when she reported a swarm of tiny glowing objects darting about one of the rooms. She said they looked like fireflies. One of the strange sparks dropped to the floor and glowed. June Redding called the California Parapsychology Foundation about the mysterious darting orbs of light. After an on-site investigation, an official told her the things were ectoplasmic tubes, and that if several of them came together, they would form a figure from the spirit world. A few days later, a number of the so-called tubes melded in the life-size figure of a young woman formed at the bottom of the bed. Mrs. Redding said it looked to her as if the figure was folding clothes or perhaps packing a suitcase. She thinks it was one of the daughters since the bizarre scene unfolded in their bedroom. The apparition lasted only a few seconds. 16 years earlier, on October 1960, a Mrs. Kirby of New Westminster, British Columbia, had an equally intriguing brush with a female resident of the Whaley house. While her husband, a prominent Canadian physician, stayed behind downstairs to discuss the early medical history of the San Diego with June Redding, Mrs. Kirby set off to explore the upstairs rooms. A few minutes later, Mrs. Kirby returned to her husband's bedside. She told Mrs. Redding that a soft breeze had blown across her face, and a strong force pushed against her as she tried to climb the stairs. In each of the bedrooms, a strong sense of being followed or being watched caused her to turn around quickly several times to catch a glimpse of her silent companion. No one was ever there. Dr. and Mrs. Kirby and June Redding then walked into the courtroom filled with display cases exhibiting documents and other memorabilia from Pioneer San Diego. Mrs. Kirby stopped. She said there was a dark-complexioned woman with dark hair and eyes standing in the corner. She wore a calico dress, had gold hoop earrings, and some type of cap on her head. Dr. Kirby and Mrs. Redding saw no one. Mrs. Kirby seemed to sense that the woman lived in the courtroom and the trio was invading her privacy. June was puzzled. No one of the Whaley house would have been described as having dusky skin. The identity of this mysterious woman may have been discovered a few years later during a visit by Kay Sterner, founder and president of the California Parapsychology Foundation. Sterner wrote that she saw a ghost near the door of one of the Whaley daughters' bedrooms and then heard loud screams. A woman with black hair wearing a long flowing skirt materialized. Sterner then saw the reenactment of a violent quarrel in which a Mexican man seemed to be pointing accusingly at the woman. To Sterner's horror, the man plunged a knife into the woman's abdomen. June Redding told Sterner that a Mexican couple had been tenants in Whaley's house decades earlier, and the husband had indeed murdered his wife in nearly the same manner Kay Sterner described. The other frequently noted spirit in Whaley's house is that of a little girl child known as the Washburn Girl. She was a playmate of the Whaley children. One day, while running to join her friends in the backyard, she ran into a low-lying clothesline and fell, striking her head on a rock. She died in Mr. Whaley's arms as he carried her into the house. Mrs. Redding remembered a particularly striking photograph that purportedly showed the littlest ghost. A lady came in during the holidays, Mrs. Redding said, and took a picture in the upstairs bedroom. She got the figure of a little girl in the photograph. It was terribly impressive. She held it under very difficult circumstances because it was actually photographed through glass. Panes of glass had been erected to prevent visitors from physically entering the second-floor bedrooms. The little girl is confused, Mrs. Redding believes, because she died so very young. Her occasional return to the house occurs most often in the kitchen, where she amuses herself with the pots and pans and utensils as she probably did in life. She plays around on the stairs and moves things in the kitchen, Mrs. Redding said. One of the reasons we closed off the kitchen was that the meat cleaver on the rack in there would move. People were fascinated with that. We allowed visitors to walk through the kitchen, but we finally decided that wasn't a good practice. Everyone thought there was something mechanical that caused the meat cleaver to move. The old courtroom, converted by Thomas Whaley from its original use as a granary, has been restored to appear precisely as it did when San Diego first used it a century or more ago. The jury box, lawyers' tables, a judge's bench, and spectator benches all make it seem like a trial could be held there at any time. Display cases contain artifacts from early San Diego history. Historical photographs hanging from the plaster walls recount important events and personages from the city's past. Whaley House ghosts sometimes clamor for the same attention tourists pay to the courthouse physical fragments of history. A group of 75 high school students from Chula Vista, California, witnessed one of the most bizarre events ever recorded at Whaley House. It happened in the courtroom. The students were fairly typical, along with several visiting teenagers from Mexico City. They had spent the day touring historic sites in and around San Diego. By the time they got to the Whaley House late in the afternoon, a gentle early morning rain had become a severe storm. They hadn't made an appointment, June Redding said about the group that showed up on the front porch. I had only one helper with me. I really didn't know how we were going to handle all 75 of them. We got them all seated in the courtroom after I got chairs from around the house. I found 3 chairs for the teachers. The bus driver just leaned against one of the showcases in the back. Mrs. Redding took her place in the front of the room near the judge's bench. A low wooden railing separated her from the students. 2 chains stretched from either end of the railing to both walls, installed to prevent eager tourists from sitting in the judge's chair. I launched into the story of Thomas Whaley's trip around Cape Horn, Mrs. Redding recalled, an adventure that was a milestone in Whaley's life. It took him over a month to make the journey around South America, surviving exceptionally rough seas and a near capsizing in a 106-foot schooner. Mrs. Redding discovered that the students had just visited the Star of India, a majestic 19th century schooner berthed at the San Diego harbor. They buzzed with conversation about what must have been like to have taken a long sea voyage 100 years ago. I soon found, or thought I had found, that they were fascinated with the story because they were all very, very quiet, Mrs. Redding said. I got to the part where Thomas was making the actual trip around Cape Horn. They were all looking at me very intently. Mrs. Redding thought they were unusually quiet for a group of teenagers, but attributed it to a long day of walking and sightseeing. But that wasn't the reason for the hushed audience, as she found out. As June Redding described Whaley's hardship around Cape Horn, the chains on either side of the railing were undulating in wave-like motions. The students, teachers, and bus driver all saw the phenomenon. Mrs. Redding was facing toward her audience. The chains to either side and behind her prevented her from seeing the unusual visual aid. Once she discovered the reason for their rapt attention, Mrs. Redding had a difficult time getting the students back on the bus. They wanted to see that trick again. I thought to myself that it made sense. That trip around the Cape was a high point in his life, Mrs. Redding said. The students had actually witnessed some kind of psychic phenomenon. I would have triggered it because I knew I was talking about something that was very important to him. In mid-June 1988, volunteer guide Mrs. Jessie Keller said that she returned from lunch to find 3 adults and a group of elementary school children gathered on the spacious porch. If it's a slow day, Whaley House is closed over the noon hour. One of the guides for the school had eyes like saucers, Mrs. Keller said. She said she heard something. She was standing by the outside double doors waiting for us to come back. All of a sudden, the door open on the left started rattling. It was just like someone was in the house shaking it. 2 other adults witnessed the event, along with the children, who got very excited at the incident too. Odd events were reported almost weekly at Whaley House. A chance visit might include a meeting with Yankee Jim Robinson or Thomas Whaley himself. More likely, however, will be the soft rustle of a woman's bustled skirt, a man's heavy footfalls, giggling children by the music room door, a piano playing while no keys move, and perhaps it will be a child's footsteps pounding up the stairs. If you're an animal lover, maybe Thomas Whaley's old dog, Dolly Varden, will race down the hallway in front of you, as she did a few years ago in front of several startled visitors. Along with the Winchester House in San Jose and the Queen Mary, Burke, and Long Beach, San Diego's Whaley House occupies a prominent place in haunted California. But don't expect clanking chains or oozing slime dripping from the walls. You see, no one who works at Whaley House has ever really been afraid. It's all very gentle, June Redding emphasized. With the possible exception of angry old Yankee Jim Robinson and the murdered Hispanic woman, the ghosts are those of a family that dearly loved their home, and a little girl who found the house so nice to visit that she'd never left. To their way of thinking, they have every right to remain right where they are. Home sweet home. Thank you for listening to my story, and hopefully next week another one will be uploaded.